Bienvenidos a la batalla de las ideas. De mi lado izquierdo, pesando 124 toneladas de libros, 400 millones de neuronas, cuestionándose el porqué de la vida y preguntándose no te creas todo lo que piensan. Escribiendo libros sobre la mente, Daniel Dennet, sobre la conciencia, Michael Shermer, por qué gente cree cosas extrañas como la superstición, por qué la gente niega el holocausto, gente que se ha cuestionado si realmente la religión, y sobre todo después del 11 de septiembre, le ha hecho más daño a la humanidad que bien. De mi lado derecho, dos grandes teólogos, dos grandes también oradores, pesando toneladas de pies de página y citas en la historia. Una persona que ha defendido de viva voz, a través de los mejores estudios y los mejores libros que yo haya conocido sobre el islamismo, los mejores libros y los mejores estudios del cristianismo, 2 pesos completos. De mi lado izquierdo, Patricia Mercado. Bienvenida. La idea aquí es que los voy a invitar a ambos. I will invite both of you. D'Souza, are you ready? You're ready? Come here, please. I will explain to you the rules of the game. El que gane, ya se los había dicho. Whoever wins decides if you want to start, if you want to begin. Whoever wins decides. You will have each of you 10 minutes. Cada uno de ustedes tendrá 10 minutos to explain and to make your point, para hacer su punto. After that, you will have 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes. Then, it will come again to you, for example, and you will have a question for one of them or for both. And then you will have 5 minutes to make again another point. Then you will have the time to make a question and 5 minutes to make a point, and the same with you. At the end, you have 2 minutes. This is a tricky one. 2 minutes just to say in which way do you think that the other person in a way is right. Because don't believe everything you think. The point is to understand the other perspective in a way. Everybody has something and probably a reason to think the way they think. Do you like the rules? Okay, please, por favor, no golpes bajos. No partidos políticos. No estamos haciendo. Please, good luck. ¿Quién escoge? Águila o sol? Tails or heads? Wow. Es una águila. Águila es... Está en pesos, güey. Quédate. Okay. So the winner is... You have to say águila o sol. Please don't confuse me, okay? Águila or son. Va. Sol, son. Ganó águila. They won. Would you like to begin or would you... let them begin. Okay, you begin. Okay. Please go to your sides. Okay. Con ustedes, la pregunta es, the question is religion good for humanity? Señoras y señores, esta no es una pregunta sin trascendencia. Este es el debate que hoy se vive en el mundo, en las portadas del Atlantic Monthly Review, en los libros de Richard Dawkins, de Daniel Dennet, de Michael Shermer, de ellos, de Esposito, de D'Souza. Este es el debate. Después del 11 de septiembre ha renacido este debate. En las suelas ideas estamos en el tiempo de la vanguardia del tema del debate. Welcome. Good luck. 10 minutes. He needs some water. Que necesita un poco de agua.
All right, here we go. So the question is religion good for humanity? And I want to amend the question immediately. Is religion good for humanity today? Let's not worry about the past. I have a farm in Maine, and some years ago I was planning to replant my hayfield. And a neighbor of an old farmer said, Dan, you want to plant oats as a nurse crop when you plant your Timothy hay. And I said, what's a nurse crop? And he said, well, the oats as a nurse crop, they will come up faster. They are more hardy. They will grow faster, and they will protect the hay the young, tender Timothy until it's ready. The nurse crops you just plant once, and it's a ladder you climb, and then you harvest the nurse crop, and then you have your hay. And I thought, well, that's a very good idea. That's what I did. What I want to suggest to you is that religion has been a nurse crop for science. That religion may indeed have prepared the way and been an essential preparation for the world of science we have now. But it's time to harvest that nurse crop and move on. Well, which religions are we talking about here? There are many different religions. Religions come in so many different varieties that it's foolish to make generalizations about them all. We have benign versions and we have toxic variants. And just to remind you, I'm going to concentrate on 3 recent toxic variants. Jonestown, everybody knows about, everybody remembers that, and everybody deplores Jonestown. Here is a much more recent one. Syed Pervez Kambaksh was sentenced to death in Afghanistan a few months ago for blasphemy. As Steve Pinker said earlier, that used to be a capital crime, and in some places it still is. Now, just a few days ago, his execution was commuted. Now, only 20 years in prison. I think that is toxic, and I think it is important for all of us to say so. It is not tolerance for religious difference that buttons one's lip and says, this is not toxic. This is evil. This is toxic. And I have one more, even closer in time, and that is this one. Yes, you may chuckle. It's hilarious. It is preposterous. It is also extremely dangerous. It is obscenely stupid and dangerous, and I think it is our duty to discredit this stupid, dangerous notion, and it is all over the web. There are probably hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of my countrymen who actually say they believe this, and that is a foolish and toxic aspect of religion. Now, aside from those very dramatic cases of toxicity, I think the prevailing problem with religion is that it's a sort of unscience. Let me tell you what I mean by this. A few months ago, I debated Lord Winston in London, and the question was, is religion the greatest threat to rational scientific worldview? And I said, well, if it isn't, what is? What is the greatest threat to a rational scientific worldview? And I came up with a number of candidates. It might be alcohol. It might be drugs. It might be violent video games. I suppose it might be advertising. Well, all of these, in their different ways, can disable you. But religion doesn't just disable. It honors the disability. It obliges you to wallow in irrationality at some point, and it honors this, and I think this is the single most difficult feature of religions to tolerate and to accept, because it really is a danger to the world. But I also am prepared to grant it doesn't equally affect everybody. Some people are more disabled than others by this idea that their religion obliges them to be irrational at times. Well, back to the question, is religion good for humanity today? Certainly most people think it is. Most people are quite sure that religion is a good thing. And this in itself causes a serious problem. The problem it creates is that there is simply no good reason at all to believe in Zeus, I think you will agree, or Poseidon, or Zoroaster, or Jehovah, or Allah. The traditional gods, there is simply no good reason to believe in them at all. We have very good explanations of why it is that people came to believe in these gods, but no good reason to think that they're right. And I think that people realize that. So there's no good reason to believe in God, but there are good reasons to say that you do. And this is the main thing I want to talk about in a few minutes that I have. The good reasons, by the way, are, I think probably the most pressing one is fear. A lot of people are afraid. Steve Pinker was talking earlier about failed states. I think a lot of people are afraid that if we don't hold up our own here with religion, that if the world goes into an a-religious state, the whole world will become a sort of failed state. And that would be a very dire prospect indeed. I think that they're wrong, but I appreciate that if that's what you think, then you must indeed believe that there is a very good reason to preserve the myth of religion. And this leads to what I call belief in belief. Now, many people believe in God. All around the world, there's many people who believe in God in one way or another. Many more people believe in God. That is to say, they think belief in God is a really good thing, an important thing. They're prepared to work hard to achieve greater compliance with the policy of believing in God. How do I know that many more people believe in God? Because all the people who believe in God but have lost their faith fall into this category. And I don't think there's anybody in the category of believing God but not thinking it's a particularly good belief to have. You may know one or two who regret their belief in God, but they're quite rare. Now, this has been appreciated by religions for a long time, and Cardinal Ratzinger, as he then was, he's now Pope Benedict, in a declaration just a few years ago, has a wonderful phrase which he actually emphasizes. He talks about what Catholics are required to profess. That is, you can require somebody to profess something even if they don't believe it. Now, why would anybody do that? By the way, returning to the theme of this, you simply can't believe everything you think. You can't believe everything you say, but you can be obliged by your religious leaders to say things that you can't believe. And in fact, that's one of the things that many religious leaders themselves treat as a virtue. It is a virtue to profess things that you, by your own lights, do not understand and cannot understand. And I view that as itself a very dangerous thing. What this creates is nothing short of systematic hypocrisy all over the world. All over the world. People say, well, at least we're not atheists, when what they believe in is so different from one person to another that it's a joke. I talked with a very eminent Episcopal priest in the United States a few years ago who told me about some of his in-laws, some of his relatives, who were Mormons. And he spent a holiday with them, and he came back from that, and this is what he said: when I found out what my Mormon relatives meant by God, I rather wish they didn't believe in God. He and his Mormon relatives do not really share a belief. In fact, the only thing that unites their belief is the use of the term. A journalist who studied religions a lot said the other day at a meeting I was at in Chicago, he said, people say there's no polytheism in America. Oh no, there's hundreds and hundreds of different religions in America. It's just that their gods are all called Jesus. And I think there's an element of truth in that. It's a silly, here's Lucy. Lucy believes that rock is to die for. Desi thinks that rock is to die for. Lucy is thinking of rock Hudson. Desi is thinking of rock music. They don't really agree at all about anything. It's too late for religion. The human race has grown up. You need to foster the evolution of benign forms of religion carefully. Thank you very much.
Bravo. Thank you. You will also have 10 more seconds like Daniel Dennet had. D'Souza.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? been listening very carefully to Daniel Dennet, and I feel a little bit like the mosquito in the nudist colony. I'm really not sure where to begin. But I want to begin by saying that I believe in God. And why? In part because it gives us an explanation for some of the deepest questions that science has not even seriously begun to answer. Why do we have something, which is to say a universe, instead of nothing? Why do we have life instead of non-life? Why should we be good? How can we teach morality to our children? What is the purpose of life if it has any purpose at all? Science has made, you might say, some attempt, but in fairness, hasn't made any real progress in addressing these questions. People believe in God not because they are bad scientists, but because they are more curious and they recognize that life is more mysterious and offers up questions that science does not even purport or pretend to answer. I want to suggest, if I may, that many of the values that even Daniel Dennet and Michael Shermer believe in and have defended throughout their life, you might say secular values or atheist values, are themselves dependent on a religious worldview. For example, the idea of the individual, the idea of dissent, the idea of science as an independent or autonomous enterprise. In fact, I point out to you that it's no accident that science developed within the orbit of Western civilization. It developed within the bowels of Christendom. Many of the greatest scientists of all time, from Copernicus to Galileo to Kepler to Boyle to Newton, were not only deeply religious, but they saw their scientific work as revealing the handiwork of God in the universe. So they saw no incompatibility between science and God at all. Now, even more than that, I want to argue that science even today is based on suppositions that derive from a religious worldview. Let's take, for example, the idea that we live in a rational universe, or we live in a lawful universe, a universe whose objects can be described in the strange language of mathematics, an orderly universe. Moreover, not only do we believe in a rational universe, but we believe that the rationality of our minds is capable of comprehending the rationality of the universe out there. Now, why should this be so? If we are merely evolved primates, we would develop the techniques of survival, but we wouldn't necessarily figure out how to determine the rotation of the planets, or E equals mc square, or Newton's inverse square law. Why do we believe that our beliefs are not merely useful, but also true? I've said a little bit of a word about science. I also want to talk about how God, or the belief in God, and in this case Christianity, has been responsible for much of the great moral advances of mankind. Earlier, Steven Pinker mentioned the universality of slavery. We've had slavery in every known civilization. Only in one culture, which is Western civilization, did slavery become controversial. You had an anti-slavery movement only in the West. By the way, in every society there's one group of people that doesn't want to be slaves, and that is, of course, the slaves themselves. But only in Western culture have you had movements to abolish slavery for everybody. Abraham Lincoln said, "As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master." He doesn't want to be a slave. He doesn't want to be a master either. So where did these anti-slavery movements come from? Well, in the West, they came out of the Christian idea that we are all created equal in the eyes of God. And because we are all created equal in the eyes of God, groups of Christians who had previously put up with slavery began to say, wait a minute, no man has the right to rule another man without his consent. And this idea became not only the basis for abolishing slavery, but it also became the basis of modern democracy. Because even today, democracy is based on the idea that no man has the right to rule another without consent. When Thomas Jefferson, a man of the Enlightenment, a very dubious or unorthodox Christian, sat down to write down what is the source of human dignity, what is the source of our inalienable rights, he could only think of one, and that is they come from our Creator. If they don't come from there, Jefferson couldn't say where else they come from. Now, we're debating here the benefits of religion, the blessings of belief in God. You always have to ask, compared to what? And some people say, well, let's say compared to Europe. Europe is a relatively secular culture, but they don't go around killing each other in Europe. But that's because Europe is a culture that is still embedded in Christian assumptions and Christian values. And even people who have ceased to believe in God still believe in those values. If you really want to look at a truly atheist society, you have got to look at some of the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. I'm thinking not only of Mao in China, I'm thinking not only of Stalin in Russia, not only of the Nazi regime in Germany, but many others. Ceausescu, Kim Jong-il, Fidel Castro, Pol Pot. Consider a regime like Pol Pot's in Indochina. After the Vietnam War, in a very short space of about 3 years, this atheist regime managed to wipe out about 2 million people. 2 million people. Even bin Laden in his wildest dreams does not even come close. And if you look at the big atheist regimes of Stalin and Mao and Hitler, those regimes in about 5 decades have managed to kill upwards of 100 million people. Now, atheism has produced an ocean of blood and a mountain of bodies. Even the Inquisition, which is the great horror and embarrassment of Christianity. If you read the scholarship on the Inquisition, over a period of 350 years, the Inquisition killed about 2,000 people. 2,000 people over 350 years. It's about 5 guys a year. There's absolutely no comparison between the crimes of religion and the crimes of atheism. Now, Richard Dawkins, a leading atheist, the author of the book The God Delusion, says you have to wait a minute here because the Christians killed in the name of Christianity. The radical Muslims kill in the name of religion. You might have had tyrants who happened to be atheist, but they didn't kill in the name of atheism. Now, Dawkins is a pretty well-known biologist, as many of you know, but sometimes I think it's better to keep the biologist inside the laboratory. And the reason is that here is a guy who evidently doesn't know much history. All you have to do is look at the works of Marx, and you see that religion is not incidental, it's actually central to the Marxist scheme. The whole idea of Marx is that religion is a drug, an opium of the masses, and the basic idea here is that we are trying to create a new man and a new utopia liberated from the shackles of traditional religion and traditional morality. And so my conclusion is that it is atheism and not religion that is responsible for the mass murders of history. And I want to make a final point about the benefits or the blessings of religion. And that is ultimately, religion causes us to believe in cosmic justice in the world. Here's what I mean by this. Life is very unfair. We all believe in justice. We say what goes around comes around, but it's not true. Many times the bad guy ends up on top. Many times the good guy comes to grief. Now, all the great religions of the world, for what all their disagreements are based on the assumption that there is ultimate moral accountability. In Hinduism, you are a lousy guy in your last life, well, we'll be seeing you as a cockroach in your next life. Cosmic justice. So the idea here is that if you were to remove God from the world, the writer Dostoevsky says in The Brothers Karamazov, if God is not, everything is permitted. And what he means is that if you remove God from the world, then there is no 10 commandments, no basis of morality. We are, in a sense, nothing more than evolved primates. If you look at the Nature Channel and you watch the baboon kingdom, one baboon goes into the lair of another, bludgeons the baboon to death, grabs his wife, drags her and rapes her, and we all watch in fascination. This is the way nature is. This is the way things are. The point is, religion gives us ultimately a reason to be good, a reason to transmit that goodness to our children, and ultimately hope for a better and more just future. Thank you.
How many people here believe in God? Okay. Look, the time is slipping away here. You didn't tell me it was going to be this lopsided. But we're not talking about is there a God or not. We're talking about here, is religion been a force for good or evil in the world? And to that extent, I would answer the question briefly. That is, religion is good when it does good, evil when it does evil. And so what we end up with is tallying the sheet up, good on one side, evil on the other side. And I think this does not bode well for religion. On the one hand, yes, of course, you can find some good that religions do, but it reminds me of Winston Churchill's comment in his observations of Americans when he said, "You can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else." I suppose that's especially relevant in the last 8 years. But anyway, hopefully that'll change. And that does remind me, actually, I would modify the quote to say, you can always count on religion to do the right thing after it's tried everything else. And by that I mean, I think what actually happens is religions follow. They do not lead. They follow cultural, social, political, and economic trends that have already begun for other reasons, and then they fall into place, justify their actions with scriptures from holy books to say, look, we always believe this, here's the passage to support it, and then take credit for the change that actually came about for other reasons. Let's take slavery as an example. Upon Dinesh's own recommendation to me last year when we debated was to watch a film called Amazing Grace about the story of Wilberforce, the slavery abolitionist in England. As an example, he said, of a Christian doing something in the name of God to right social injustice. So I did. The remarkable thing about the Wilberforce story is that he was going up against all of his other Christian abolition or non-abolitionists, pro-slavery holders, people that held slaves, people that justified slavery in the name of Christianity, people that cited the Bible to justify Christianity. These were the enemies against which Wilberforce was trying to convince the abolitionist movement to take off. And it didn't happen very rapidly. It took decades to convince all those Christians that what they were doing was actually immoral. And in fact, Wilberforce was just on the heels of a growing enlightenment movement that valued human life in and of itself. Without, whether there's a God or not, human life has value. So slavery is an old example. A more recent example, I would say, since I'm from the great state of California, where we just had on our election on Tuesday a gay marriage bill, which did not pass. But mark my words, here's what's going to happen. At the moment, almost all Christians think homosexuality is an abomination, it's a sin, they should not get married, they should not have the same rights as other people. Within a decade, maybe two at most, here's what will happen. All that'll change. It'll change because the people who are being subjected, as Dinesh said, the people that don't like slavery are slaves, the people that don't think there should be bigotry and persecution against them are the gays, in this case. This will come about by them standing up and saying, that's enough, we're not going to put up with this anymore. And we're going to change the law, and that will change. And then what will happen is you'll find in the historical record a few Christian pro-gay marriage bloggers and writers and so on, and then the religious people will go back and pick them out and say, look, we took credit for this all along. But note right now, and remember this, that's who's against that equal treatment under the law, is Christians. Now, Dinesh made a comment about science coming out of religion. Not quite, that's not quite right. Christianity, through scholasticism, gave us a tradition of linking Aristotle to Aquinas to reason and rationality. What makes science different is not that it's reason, that it uses reason and logic, it's that it's empirical. That it doesn't matter what the authority says based on reason and logic, it matters what's actually out there in the world. And when you go check it, that's the only thing that matters. So at the time that Dinesh was talking about science growing out of Christianity, in fact, what it was called the battle of the books, the book of nature versus the book of authority. At the time, dominated by the Christian church, authority was the final arbiter. Science had to battle against that, as when Galileo said, yeah, but if you actually look through the tube to his fellow Vatican astronomers, you'll see that there's moons around Jupiter and spots on the sun. And all those things that the Catholic Church authority said can't be there because the authority of Aristotle, using reason and logic, said they can't be there. This is Aristotelian cosmology. All orbits have to be circular. All objects in space must be perfectly round and perfectly smooth, and so forth. All that was wrong, and it's only because Galileo made the Vatican astronomers actually look through his telescope, and they could finally see that the church authorities were wrong. That's the only way it comes about, is actually looking through the tube, and it's science that does that, not religion. In my last 5 minutes, I want to make a few comments about the actual nature of the question. Does religion make you more moral? Well, we can address this on several different levels. One, if you go to Google and you Google George Barna is an evangelical Christian who has an institute in Santa Barbara that collects data on moral behavior. His conclusion is that believers are no more moral than non-believers. Believers get divorced just as much as non-believers. They have adulterous affairs just as much as non-believers. They cheat on their taxes just as much as non-believers. There's no single measure ever recorded, and I'm not giving you the atheist webpage, I'm giving you the evangelical Christian webpage, George Barna. There's no single empirical measure that says religion makes people more moral on an individual level. On a national level, there was a study published 2 years ago in the Journal of Religion and Society, correlating the 19 Western democracies with their levels of religiosity and various measures of moral behavior. The inverse correlation was that the more moral the nation, the more religious the nation was, based on self-professed belief in God, how often people go to church in that country, and so forth, and their levels of crime, STD rates, abortion rates, teen pregnancy rates, suicide rates, all went up. Got it? As religion goes up in a nation, crime rate goes up, STD rate goes up, abortion rates goes up, teen pregnancy rates go up. Any measure that we would, by Christian measures, say those are moral measures, religion does not make those nations more moral. It makes them less moral. As for the wars, this is complete nonsense, Dinesh. The 100 Years' War, the 30 Years' War, the Inquisition, the witch hunts, the American Civil War, 600,000 dead. Northern Christians killing Southern Christians, fighting over slavery. They're all Christians. World War I, German Christians killing French Christians and British Christians killing German Christians. They're all Christians. Even in World War II, the Japanese emperor is a God figure. Mussolini was a good Catholic. Hitler, well, maybe not such a good Catholic, but a Catholic nonetheless. Roosevelt, a Christian. Churchill, a Christian. This was not an atheistic war because nobody kills in the name of no God. What would you be killing in the name of? There is no belief system of atheism where we're going to fight for atheism by killing you. No, people kill in the name of God. They do not kill in the name of no God. Now, none of this would matter if we all follow the principle of liberty. That is, I should have the freedom to think, believe, and act in any way I want, as long as it doesn't infringe on your freedom to think, act, and believe anything you want. That would be fine if everybody believed that. Who doesn't believe that? The theocracies of the world don't believe that. And that's the problem. The fundamentalist religionists of the world do not feel the world will be right until every knee is bowed and every mind is chained. That's the problem. The solution is the spread of liberal democracy and free trade so that people can treat each other individually as just human beings with values in and of themselves, whether there's a God or not the spread of more religion. The spread of more religion encourages and fosters the tribalism that is our natural state. Democracy and free trade breaks down those natural tribal barriers and allows people to treat each other as individuals. So in the end, it comes down to what Rabbi Hillel said when he repeated the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's the only law that matters. All the rest is commentary. Thank you.
Wow, put attention. John Esposito, otro peso completo. Bienvenido. Welcome.
Let me begin by saying that, as Brzezinski noted, the 20th century was the bloodiest century in history. But as he also noted, they were not wars fought in the name of religion. They were fought in the name of another ideology, nationalism. And if we look at the bloodshed in Iraq and Afghanistan, while you may see religionists fighting within, most of the bloodshed that occurs and occurred in Iraq and Afghanistan were fought in the name of liberal democracy, putting aside whether or not George Bush is Christian and what his motivations may have been. I should also begin by saying that my comments that I'm going to make now are irrespective of my own religious belief. But I should tell you at the beginning, I am a Roman Catholic, was in a monastery for 10 years, have degrees in Catholic theology and taught that for years, have my doctorate in Islam and in Hinduism and Buddhism. And so my comments come from that. I have been a believer for many years, and I have been an atheist for many years. But whether or not I talk about religion and belief in God and see it as constructive as well as destructive really has to do with my observations of how I have seen religion and the fact that, being a pluralist, I believe that people should be able to be religious as irreligious, and think that both atheists and religious folk can both be good and can be dangerous. And as far as I'm concerned, I think history demonstrates that. So, let me get into a couple of introductory comments. First of all, I've learned a lot here, and I want to thank you for that. And my wife was supposed to come, but I'm delighted she didn't at the last minute, because the idea that I had to sit here with a woman I've been married for 43 years who's going to hear that my brain was marinated in my testosterone would just create tremendous problems when we have our discussions. We've never argued, of course, in 43 years. But the second thing, which I found great offense with, and I have a real problem with in terms of the organizers, is you can attack my faith, you can attack my family, but you don't attack my BlackBerry, nor my attachment to my BlackBerry. And if Gene had been here today, I would have never heard the end of it. Okay, let's talk about religion. We hear today about how science has succeeded religion. Well, you know, one of the words that I use a lot when I talk, and my wife always says you shouldn't use it because it doesn't convey meaning, is stupid. And I always say it makes me feel good. She says it doesn't communicate anything. Dennis used stupid a lot. And I think the position that somehow science has now replaced religion is stupid. The fact is, we've had explanations from magic to witchcraft to religion and science, and today the answers that people look for, depending on the people, come both from religion and science. Some people choose one or the other, but many people feel they both work well together. Part of the problem we have even in this debate is that in the 20th century, there was a notion that to be modern meant to become westernized and secularized. And the presumption was that as people became better educated and more secular, they would become less religious. Not just that religion would be restricted to private life, but they'd become less religious. Anthony Wallace, a well-known anthropologist of religion, in the beginning of his book, basically said, I was raised a believer, but then I kind of grew up and realized that empiricism simply replaced, a human-centered world with its empirical knowledge, simply replaced a divine-centered world. The problem is it's not an either-or, certainly not for religionists. Some religionists go into an either-or world of selecting one or the other. Many do not. That's why we have many very well-educated people, many people who have a profile just as their atheist friends, but who also are believers. In the 20th century, we not only presume the pattern of the growing secularization of society, but as a result, we had the death of God theology. Now, on the one hand, many people thought that simply meant that God was dead. That was true. But for others, it meant God, as we talk about him in traditional paradigms or models, is dead. And unless one gets new paradigms, we're going to have a problem. But very quickly, that notion of the secularization of society, which Harvey Cox celebrated and later backed away from, and the notion of the death of God was overtaken by the global resurgence of religion. And so suddenly people had to deal with the phenomenon of, well, wait a minute, there's now, as Peter Berger said, who initially talked about secularization as inevitable, there's a desecularization of society. Now, if you believe in the former, the tendency is to then think that the latter is really a problem. Just as some religious folk, when they hear people who are scientists and who are atheists, think, oh my God, then if my kid really studies science really closely, he's going to be an atheist. They create this either-or world. I don't think that ultimately is the case. I think what we do have to recognize, though, is that all religions have their transcendent side and their dark side. They believe in a transcendent reality, and they enable people to transcend themselves, to be better than they might normally have been, whether it's their moral life, their spiritual life, etc. But religion has its dark side, like any ideology. I want to emphasize that. Wars have been fought in the name of democracy. If President Bush had had his way, we would have redrawn the map of the Middle East in the name of the promotion of democracy. So let's not be foolish about this. But religion has had its dark side and still does. I deal with a religious tradition that has particularly come in for a grand slam, and that is Islam. But the fact is, part of the problem we have, and this ties in with some of our earlier speakers, is that often people go with their intuitions or what they hear everybody else say. And regrettably, when you get into an area like dealing with Islam in the Muslim world, and whether 9/11 signaled a religion that is evil, or it signaled some religious believers who were evil, is out there, but most people don't have the data to respond to it. We have experts who take diametrically opposed positions. How can that be? Experts with wonderful training and reputations. Bernard Lewis, Martin Kramer, the Darth Vaders, as I like to call them, of my profession. On the other hand, we have a whole group of folks, myself and others, who are, I believe, the forces of light. Others see us as the forces of darkness. We have the same training, the same experience. But part of the problem is we are content to listen to talking heads on Sunday. We are content to listen to militant Muslim religious leaders and Christian religious leaders. We are content to listen to a battle of experts, all of whom tell you what the vast majority of Muslims are like, but do not have the data for what the vast majority of Muslims believe. And in fact, today we do. The Gallup organization has done a poll which represents 90% of the world's Muslims, 1 billion Muslims. And what we discover when we look there is that, yes, a minority of Muslims are extremists. We know that as a fact. And yes, a minority of Muslims are also politically radicalized. That is, they're not engaging in violence now, but given their position, unless that position is turned, or many of them are turned, they could be recruited. However, what our data shows is 90 to 93% of the Muslims in the world, in fact, abhor the attacks on 9/11, even if many of them don't like American foreign policy. That in fact, both political radicals and mainstream are not thinking when they have resentment towards the West or even anti-Americanism, they're not thinking about a clash of religion or culture. They're thinking about a clash of interest in foreign policy. That's a fact. Some say, is Islam incompatible with democratization? Is it incompatible with women's rights? We find in our data, and I hate to plug the book, Who Speaks for Islam, What a Billion Muslims Really Think, we find that majorities of Muslims want democratization, but they also want their religious values. That majorities of men and women across the Muslim world, including in Saudi Arabia, in the 60th percentile, believe that women should have legal rights, citizenship, education, holding positions, and if you like the question, driving cars. 61% of Saudi women believe they should be able to drive a car as well as have top positions. And they don't see it as necessary to have that in a secular framework. They believe that it's compatible with their interpretation of religion. Because as we know from experience, religion like any ideology, is capable of multiple interpretations and is capable of change over periods of time. We all think and grow, both in our secular values and the way we view the world and in our religious values. Classic example is myself. I'm a lifelong Democrat. I picked Nixon over Kennedy. Even worse, my wife reminded me at a party that I voted for Barry Goldwater, to which I blocked that out completely. I mean, the reality of it is we grow and change, and my position today would be much different. And the same thing happens with many of us in our moral positions, in our religious positions, and in our political positions. As I love to say to Muslims, you'll become like ethnic Italians. You know when you make it, you'll move from being a Democrat to a Republican. I mean, the reality of it is we have a lot of reasons for why we change our positions. So I look forward to the rest of the debate, even though I know that the forces of light will prevail. Thank you.
Bravo. Daniel Dennet, tienes, o Michael Shermer, una pregunta para ellos, one question to them, and 5 minutes, whatever you want.
No, I have to ask a question.
You have to ask a question, and then you have 5 minutes also to elaborate on whatever you wish.
Okay, but first I ask the question and then he answers and then
No, you just ask the question, elaborate 5 minutes.
Okay, all right, fine. That's fine, yep. So my question is for Dinesh, and then I guess he can answer it later. So my question is this, Dinesh, where do you get your morals from? Presumably you're a Christian, you're a Catholic. I presume you get these from God or from the Bible. But if you get them from God, how do you get them? Do you ask him and he tells you? Do you pray about it? Do you meditate about it? If you get them from the Bible, which passages do you pick and choose from? You obviously, I presume, would ignore the passages about enslaving your neighbor and your daughter and that sort of thing, and stoning to death your disobedient child or the adulterous woman down the street. In other words, you would probably ignore or discount those moral homilies in the Bible, and yet pick a few others that you like. So which ones? What's your criteria for deciding I want this one instead of that one? And if it's from if it's from God himself, are you hearing voices or what? Okay, so in my final 4 minutes, I want to make a few comments about this business of democracies versus theocracies and dictatorships and so on. We have a fair amount of data on this now, that it's very rare for democracies to fight other democracies. It's true it has happened occasionally, but it almost never happens compared to other forms of governments. One of the key aspects of liberal democracies is that they separate religion from the state. They're a secular state in the sense that it doesn't matter which religion you adhere to or which God you happen to believe in. These are the set of values and rules that we abide by in this particular country. And that's a superior position that leads to, by superior, I mean it leads to less tribalism, less violence, greater levels of prosperity and liberty and freedom for more people in more places. So I mentioned democracy and then, again, free trade. I call this Bastiat's principle. Frederick Bastiat was a 19th century French economist who said, where goods do not cross frontiers, armies will. So the corollary would be where goods do cross frontiers, armies will not. It's not a perfect law of nature. However, wherever two countries are free to trade with one another, they're far less likely to fight with one another. Those two values, liberal democracy and free trade, are a product not of religion, even if religion had some input in it. It's a product of the modern Enlightenment values of, once again, treating other people as valuable in and of themselves and just applying the golden rule. Now, I ended my 10-minute talk quoting from Scripture. Well, what I want to finally say is that, back to where I started, that the moral zeitgeist changes in culture first and then religion follows. The reason that happened is because we evolved over millions of years as a social primate species. Certain values of how we have to treat one another because we have to somehow get along with our fellow group members. So we have these amazing capacity for sympathy and empathy, altruism, reciprocal altruism, pro-social behavior, cooperativeness within our group, within our tribes. We have that capacity. That was there long before religions came upon the scene. What happened is that works really well for small groups. Around about 5,000 years ago, these small bands and tribes began to coalesce into larger chiefdoms and states and eventually into empires of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions of people. In which case, it's too easy to get away with cheating. And so you needed some form of codifying the rules of how we're going to get along as members of a social group. The two institutions that came along the scene were government and religion. Government said, these are the rules, you obey them or else justice will prevail now. Religion said, yeah, and if you still think you're going to get away with it, Mr. Big will get you later. Now, that may be true for them back then. I think we can do better. Wouldn't it be better for justice to be served now, to the extent that we can, rather than hoping that the deity takes care of Hitler in the next life? Wouldn't it be better if we treat one another with respect now in this world and not use this world as some stage for some future date that may or may not be there in some afterlife where maybe justice will be served? Of course, we all believe that. That's why we have justice systems now. Thank you.
Muy bien. Dinesh D'Souza. A question and 5 minutes, please.
I want to begin by answering Michael Shermer's question because in the process of answering it, I will state my own question. When I think about where I get my moral beliefs, in fact, they do not come from the Bible. They do not come from voices that I hear in the dark. They come from actually a most unexpected place, and I would assume that for Michael Shermer the answer is exactly the same. They actually come from within me. It is sort of, you might say, the still, small voice of conscience. This, I want to argue, has no adequate Darwinian explanation and is in fact much better understood as the voice of God within us. I'll give an example to illustrate what I mean, because it then leads to my question. Let's assume I'm walking on the river bank, and I hear somebody shout, "Help, help, help, I'm drowning." I'm not a very good swimmer. I turn, I see this person. Is it my brother? Is it my cousin? Is it my neighbor? No, it's a complete stranger. I've never met this person in my life. I have no genetic kinship with this person at all. The question becomes now, should I help this person? And an instinct in me, let's call it the Darwinist instinct, says, don't help this person. Preserve your genes. Keep walking. But the moment I start doing that, a little lamp goes on my head that says, don't do that. You should try to help. And then the other part of me says, but I'm not a very good swimmer. But then this other part of me says, that's okay. At least put out a stick and maybe you can pull the person to safety. And then the first voice says, yeah, but look how big that guy is who's drowning. If you give him the stick, he'll pull you in. The point I'm trying to make here is this. There is within the human psyche a kind of a war between the instinct for survival, on the one hand, and the perpetuation of our genes that has a full and adequate Darwinian explanation, and a rival instinct that asks us ultimately to take sacrifices that imperil our genes and imperil our sociality for people that cannot in any way benefit us. Now, you might get some big and tall stories about how that has a Darwinian explanation. Man evolved to be social. If you listen to Steven Pinker earlier, man was not all that social for tens of thousands of years. The sociality, if you will, ultimately is developed, you might say, in the rather late history of our species. Now, what about slavery? Earlier we heard about slavery and how ultimately the Christians later figured out to be against slavery because William Wilberforce had to fight against all these slave owners. Well, we kind of know why the slave owners are for slavery. They stand to benefit from it. The philosopher Immanuel Kant said a long time ago, out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. I don't think we have to explain for why human beings want to employ other human beings for free. That does not require explanation. What does require explanation is why there are movements against that. Now, interestingly, slavery was abolished in Europe for the most part between the 4th century and the 10th century. It was replaced largely by serfdom. So the anti-slavery movement did not begin in the modern era with the Enlightenment. It actually began in the medieval era, in the so-called Dark Ages. And I want to say, if I may, a word about Galileo. Because the truth of it is, Galileo has been made into a sort of secular saint, a kind of apostle of science against religion. Galileo was in fact a devout Catholic. And the truth of it is, in Galileo's time, the argument for heliocentrism, or the argument for the idea it's the earth that goes around the sun, that argument had not been conclusively established. The evidence for that only came 50 years later. If you go and read Galileo's book, he makes all kinds of erroneous and bad arguments for why the earth goes around the sun. He says, for example, that one proof that the earth goes around the sun is that we have the tides. He says, obviously, the earth is moving very fast because that's what makes the water slosh back and forth in the motions that we call the tides. Well, today we know this argument is absurd. The tides have a lot more to do with the gravitational effect of the sun and the moon acting upon the earth. So the point I'm trying to make is what we are getting here is not science, but a kind of bogus interpretation of science that is being used as a battering ram against religion. I think ultimately the effect that religion does in the world could be explained very well by an incident involving Mother Teresa. She was found by a bunch of Indian guys who were walking on the streets of Calcutta, and she was ministering to and hugging a leper. And the Indian guy said to Mother Teresa, "I wouldn't do that. We wouldn't do that for all the money in the world." And she replied, "I wouldn't either. I am doing it for the love of Christ." That is what religion makes people do in the world. Thank you.
Dinesh. D'Souza, Mr. D'Souza, what's your question for him?
My question is this. We want to teach morality in the absence of religion. If you were to teach your own sons or daughters, what would be the source of the morality you taught them, and on what basis would you teach it? There have been many philosophical systems, Hegel, Kant, Nietzsche. I don't know a single person I've ever met who got their morality from Hegel or Kant or Nietzsche. Religion today is probably the main, if not the only, mechanism for transmitting moral values to the young. If religion won't do it, what will?
Okay, muy bien. Daniel Dennet.
So let me begin with my question, and I will address it to Professor Esposito. I fully appreciate that there are a majority of Muslims who are themselves deeply offended and, in fact, deeply frightened of their Islamicist, the fanatics. And I have been trying to figure out for some time how I can help them bring order into their house. And what my liberal Islamic friends tell me is, stay away, don't try to help us. Any help you offer us will be treated by the Islamicists, by the fanatics, as a sign that we are the tools of the West. This leaves me baffled and unempowered. I don't know what to do. I wonder, what can we do to help the moderate Muslims in this world gain control over their religion? And I'll make it particularly pointed. My understanding is that when the Danish cartoon issue erupted, moderate Muslims around the world were praying for us in the West to say, don't be childish, don't be stupid. These displays that these riots, shame on you for those riots. Of course we're going to have freedom of expression. Of course we're going to allow this. And that our failure to do this pulled the political rug out from under moderate Muslim feet. If you disagree with that, I'd really like to know why. But now, let me respond to a few other points that have been raised. Dinesh has a caricature of evolutionary theory. He thinks that the only thing that evolution can explain is basic, maybe tit-for-tat reciprocity, reciprocal altruism, kin selection. And what he doesn't realize is that in the last 20 or 30 years, there has been a veritable explosion of really interesting work on the cultural evolution of moral norms in the work of many theorists, both scientists and philosophers. He wants to know where I would give the religion, where the religion would come to, where I would get the principles to educate my children or my grandchildren. And the answer is very simple. I would get it from secular philosophy, from ethics. The 20th century saw a flourishing of brilliant work by people like John Rawls and Amartya Sen, and to name somebody perhaps a little closer to your persuasion, Robert Nozick, a more sort of right-wing theorist, and many others. And they're all really building on Hume, in one way or another, I would say. Not Nietzsche particularly, not Kant. And what they're actually doing, and what philosophers have been doing for 2,000 years and more, is using their reason, the reason that evolved first genetically and then culturally, to reevaluate the values they found, if you like, in their genes. What Hume said was that we had these natural virtues, and then we as human beings, as cultivated people, develop what he called artificial virtues. And the way these develop is not by reading holy books, although holy books may have a lot of valuable lore in them as grist for the mill, but by a careful, communal, rational discussion of what do we want to do, what do we think the right things to do are. If you look at the history of morality over the last 2,000 years, you find that it has evolved tremendously. Nobody in this room would live by Old Testament morality. Nobody would live by New Testament morality unvarnished. The varnish has come from this rational exploration, and it has been secular all the way through. Is there a growing religious revival? I don't think the statistics bear that out. According to the Christian Encyclopedia, the fastest growing category in the world is secular, is no religion at all. And what I think we're seeing these days is a growing anxiety, a growing even desperation on the part of religious groups to shore up their ranks. And they're making more noise than ever. They are working harder than ever, and because they have to. The Baptists themselves recently passed a resolution deploring what their own statistics suggested, which was that only 4% of their youngsters were going to be what they called Bible-believing adults. The world, for better or for worse, is undergoing a wave of secularization. Western values are sweeping the planet, not always with pretty results. I think it behooves us all to look very closely at the effects we're creating with this wave of secularization. But the one thing that we shouldn't do is to suppose that there isn't within that wave the wherewithal, the content, the principles of ethics that we can help to spread to other people, and we can spread it to them in a purely rational way. We can say, come, sit down with us, you tell us your religious beliefs, you tell us your moral prohibitions, and Don't tell us that this is what you do because it's in your holy book. That may be true, but that doesn't settle anything. If you believe that your religion has the right moral precepts, defend them in secular terms. Why is this the right thing to do? There is plenty of scope within a perfectly secular worldview to articulate and defend morality. We may have needed religion in the past to do this for us, but we don't need it to now. In fact, it's getting in the way.
Bravo. John Esposito, please.
Well, first of all, with regard to, I'm not sure about the statistic about the growth of secularism, but certainly most demographic studies I've seen talk about the growth of, that the fastest growing religions in the world today are Islam and Christianity, particularly evangelical Christianity and the spread of its missionaries, etc. But I don't have the stats, so I'm not, I'm not going to go there on that one. How can we help Muslims? Very clear. Majorities of Muslims, again, in the Gallup World Poll, make it very clear. What majorities of Muslims basically say is, in open-ended questions, this is 35 countries, 50,000 interviews, again, the largest, most comprehensive study of the Muslim world ever done. And what first thing they say, and it goes right to the heart of the Danish cartoons in terms of framing the reaction, respect Islam and don't view Muslims as less than non-Muslims in terms of the worth of their lives, etc. And we see that. In fact, the reaction to the Danish cartoons on the part of mainstream Muslims, I'm not talking about the extremists who engaged in violence, was absolute abhorrence because feeling as if they were looked down upon and their religion was looked down upon, living in a Europe in which often they don't really have equal citizenship, to then have yourself held up, your religion to ridicule, and have your prophet portrayed as a terrorist, was considered utterly offensive. And so that's one of the things that's brought out. But it's not just that. When you actually ask, you also get a response to talk more specifically. What many Muslims say is, look, help us get exactly what we admire about what you have. We admire self-determination. We admire the rule of law. But what do you do with your policies? You continue to support authoritarian regimes. They're not about promoting democratization. They're not about an open press. They're not about an open educational system. They're not about developing civil societies. And indeed, many of your closest allies, whom you continue to support, are the very offenders. That's whether they're Democratic administrations or Republican. And indeed, in your now global war against terrorism and the notion that part of what you're doing is not just fighting terrorism, it's to spread liberal democracy. At the end of the day, have you really pushed for liberal democracy in Egypt? Have you pushed for liberal democracy in Uzbekistan and in many of the countries in the Muslim world? Those are issues that are out there. What do they say specifically also that they'd like to see? They don't want to see a double standard when it comes to the promotion of democracy. President Bush's senior State Department official, Ambassador Haas, in the first term, when we were ready to go into Iraq and said, we can't find weapons of mass destruction, what he trotted out as our excuse, and I think he was genuine when he said it, is that every American administration, he acknowledged, every American administration, including the first term of Bush up until that point, had a double standard when it came to the promotion of democracy in the Muslim world. Promote it in other parts of the world and not there. And so he said, we're now going to listen to our other friends, not just the regimes, we're going to promote that democracy. At the end of the day, that simply hasn't happened. And you could see it vividly when Karen Hughes, who meant well promoting diplomacy, public diplomacy, went to the Middle East and immediately reached out to women's audiences in Turkey and Saudi Arabia and played the women's card. When in fact, women turned around and said, in effect, hey, the first thing in our society that we have a problem with is the slaughter of men, women, and children because of what your armies are doing in your invasion in Iraq and the war that you're conducting. Not that they're not concerned about women's issues. I gave you the stats that show that they are. So there's a lot that we can do. Concretely, and this is a major issue now, you have a sea shift now taking place. People around the world are looking, whether we voted for Obama or not, they're looking for a turn in American foreign policy. They see Obama as an internationalist. I received emails from people I didn't even know the night of the elections were announced, the results, and the next morning, from all over the world saying congratulations, as if somehow I had been elected. Would that I had that plane. The rest of it they can keep, but I still want the jet. Anyway, the reality of it is that we are in a position to make a difference. But it means that an American administration has to stop doing what not only in the Muslim world, but outside the Muslim world has caused anti-Americanism. Stop looking as if in the name of liberal democracy and American, Western secular democracy, stop looking as if we're promoting a new world order, which is a new form of neocolonialism. The white man's burden, the mission to civilize, is now changed by our mission to spread democracy. And whether or not we're willing to lead with diplomacy rather than the military, to provide economic aid and educational aid, massive aid in places like Iraq, Afghanistan to rebuild the infrastructure, rather than massive export of our weapons and our military into the region.
Okay.
That's what it's about, it seems to me, if we think about the future. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, bravo. 2 minutos. Final points, 2 minutes each of you.
Final points, 2 minutes. Well, again, thanks for welcoming us to your country, and I really appreciate that. Since I'm a science guy, I want to cite one more study published last year in the Annals of Family Medicine, a study on 1,820 medical doctors, measured by their levels of religiosity or not, and how many of them help poor. That is, they practiced medicine without getting paid for it in needy areas. 31% of Christians, people who consider themselves deeply religious, practiced medicine in needy areas for no pay. 35% of atheists, doctors in this pool, worked for no money helping the poor in needy areas. Why would they do that? If religion is such a great force for moral values, why would these atheists do that? And when asked, they said, because it felt like it was the right thing to do. That's my commitment as a physician to do that. That, I think, is that still small voice, Dinesh, that you and I both get our morals from. What I'm claiming is that that still small voice comes from our deep evolutionary past. Not in some Darwinian sense, like most people think of it as selfish, cutthroat, competitive, not that kind of Darwinism. The social Darwinism, the kind of Darwinism in which you become more successful by being cooperative, pro-social, and altruistic. In my argument here, I want to claim that it's not enough to fake being a moral person in some Darwinian calculation. Therefore, you're more likely to pass on your genes for faking moral values. Because in small groups where everybody knows one another, you can tell if somebody's faking or not. You actually have to be moral, live it, believe it, and actually be moral, and that's the source of that still small voice. Thank you so much for having me.
Muy bien, Michael. Muy bien.
It's interesting that when you have a disaster in the world, let's say a huge famine tomorrow in Rwanda, there would be a big explosion of concern and compassion. And you would find that in the Western countries, there would be a great agitation to collect donations, send food, send Doctors Without Borders, and so on. However, in Indian culture, India, you would get very little of this reaction at all. In China, you would also get very little of this reaction. And why is that? If the Darwinian imperative was equally planted in everybody, all cultures should respond equally to this great human tragedy. But no, the Christian cultures would respond immediately because of a tradition of compassion developed within the Christian West. an idea of the dignity of human life, which is not common to all cultures, is not a Darwinian phenomenon. Go to ancient Greece and Rome, the Spartans would take the sick child and leave it on the hillside and were happy to find it dead in the morning. Steven Pinker has shown that infanticide is common in many cultures. So the respect for childhood, for innocence, for human life, these are not Darwinian ideas, and Darwin never thought they were. There is now an effort to rescue morality by taking Darwinian morality, which is essentially biological, and superimposing on it something that is not Darwinian at all, which is cultural evolution. Cultural evolution is everything that human beings have done since the Babylonians. And that is now, in a sense, grafted onto Darwinism as though it simply came out of our human nature, evolved from the apes. One other thing I want to notice is that science in this debate is always judged by the best and newest things it has done, and religion by the oldest and worst things it has done. When people talk about science, they don't say there was this idiot named Thales who lived in ancient Greece who thought everything was made of water. No, we judge science by Einstein in the 1950s. But when we judge religion, we say, let's go back to the Old Testament and find, in a way, the verse in the book of Numbers. You notice nobody condemned Christ or the New Testament. So if we're going to allow scientific progress, let's consider the possibility of religious progress as well. Thank you.
Muy bien. Daniel Dennet, your last point.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here speaking with you all, and I want to thank our opponents for their lively interventions. I think that Dinesh has still got a lamentably oversimple view of the Darwinian possibilities for explaining morality, and it's interesting that he should think that the best of morality in recent times is to be attributed to Christianity. This morning we heard Lawrence Krauss give a brilliant tour de force brief account of what we know about the billions of galaxies, each with their billions of stars. And the idea that the Christian God chose this one tiny planet on this in one minuscule galaxy, and several thousand years ago decided to make this in effect the center of the moral universe. Just the arrogance of that idea, the infantile quality of this self-absorption with our own beginnings strikes me as just breathtaking. And even if morality as developed in Christian nations in the West got to some of the expanding circle points that Steve Pinker talked about this morning, sooner than this afternoon, sooner than some other cultures have, it's not due to the fact that it was Christian. It's due to the fact that in those Christian cultures, in those Western cultures, there was a tradition of rational criticism and debate and freedom of debate. These were not theocratic regimes. These were Enlightenment democracies. Thank you very much.
Bravo.
Thomas à Kempis, a major theologian and something of a hermit who lived many years ago, had a saying: every time I go out among men, I come back less a man. I often say to many of my Christian and Muslim friends, because I deal with those two audiences, every time I go out among believers, I come back less a believer. But that's my way of saying to them, your kind of believer is one kind of a believer, Christian and Muslim, and you ought to think about the fact that your vision is problematic. Just as I will say to them when they are extremely exclusivist in their theologies, tying into the worldview you were talking about, your God is too small. And the fact is that just as science has grown from pre-modern to modern, so theology grows. Now, regrettably, some of our theologians and some of our church leaders, some close to a church that I'm very well associated with, haven't grown as fast as they should. But there are modern Christian and Muslim theologians who, in fact, no longer hold the kind of worldview that you have and say that basically that worldview comes from another time. It's a paradigm that, that grew out of a whole set of circumstances, and they have moved beyond it. And that's one of the things to think about when we're dealing, it seems to me. I absolutely agree with what you said about social values. I mean, to me, it's ridiculous to think that someone cannot have social values and have a strong morality, whether they're a believer or not. But the point is, it can be both, and neither are exclusive. And indeed, that's why many people who are modern educated today choose not to be atheists, others do, but feel a need and a want to be both modern educated, scientifically oriented, but be believers, because religion still answers for them some deeper dimensions of many of the critical questions of human existence. Who am I? Why am I here? What should I be doing? And why does it matter? Thank you.
Voy a pedir a Sergio Sarmiento, un destacado intelectual mexicano, que nos hiciera una pregunta. Le pasaremos el micrófono. Por favor, Sergio, un aplauso para los que lo conocen. ¿Para quién va dirigida? ¿Para este lado o para este? Ok, va.
No, thank you. Gracias. The question is if when we talk about God, there are so many versions of God. If we talk about the Muslim God, if we talk about Allah, if we talk about the God of the Jews, if we talk about the Christian God, we are talking about totally different entities. If we talk about the morality that Mr. D'Souza talked about, we're also talking about different moralities. Is it really relevant anymore to talk about, to argue about either the existence of God or the place of religion in society at a time when in fact we're talking about totally different things and we're not really arguing about the same kind of God?
I mean, I have a slightly different take on that. I don't think that on anything. I think part of the problem we have is that we always see things in terms of either or, when in our language. The fact is, just as some came to realize, before World War II, we always had a separate kind of Judaism, Christianity. But some came to realize that despite differences, there were some common roots. And so we talk about a Judeo-Christian, faith. And that means that Jews and Christians do share some commonality in terms of belief in the one true God, in terms of a set of prophets, a notion of revelation. That's not to say that they don't have differences. They share some moral bases. I would argue today that there is a Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, and there always has been. Muslims accept Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and the Revelations. But there are differences. But they see themselves as worshiping the one true God, even though there are differences. And I think the reason it's important, if for no other reason, is that this is not only a heritage. This is where many people in the world are. And with globalization, not only in terms of international relations, but in terms of Western society. 30 years ago, Muslims were invisible in the West. Today, it's the second or third largest religion. Hindus and Buddhists are here. That's important. I do think arguments about the existence of God, frankly, are tedious and irrelevant.
Muy bien. El doctor Eduardo Punset, que muchos de ustedes lo conocen a través de los programas en los que hemos colaborado conjuntamente en Canal 7 y por supuesto su gran programa Redes, un gran divulgador científico. Un aplauso que está aquí con nosotros.
Gracias. Vamos a ver una pregunta a este lado del debate. Sabéis que se hizo un experimento de un metro, de un tren que entraba en una estación, por un lado, obviamente, y en el otro extremo de la estación, en la vía, había 5 operarios en la vía trabajando. De manera que si nadie hacía nada, el tren mataba sin remedio a 5 operarios. y hubo una persona en la entrada del lado de la estación que empujó, sorry, excuse me then. I am Catalan, so I speak them all wrongly, including Castilian. So let me repeat then. There is an experiment which is very well known of a railway, in a railway station. A train was getting into the tube from one side, and at the other end of the station there were 5 workmen working down in the railway, so that if nobody did anything, the train would kill the 5 people, okay? So there was one person at the other end of the tube station who just pushed involuntarily or voluntarily, we will never know, pushed one person to the railway. He was killed, but the train stopped. So you had 1 death instead of 5 deaths. The truth is that if you try this in practice, in reality, you will find some people who have the brain organized in such a way that they will search for a solution which will be the most technical, reliable solution. That's to say, to kill somebody innocent. My question is the following. Is there innate morality which preceded by far and long the rise of religions? An innate morality who was there before religion. And the second question, can I put a second question much shorter? See, the second question is that what would happen if we devoted some time, some resources, some energy to train children, my granddaughter for instance, in the management of social and emotional intelligence. In other words, if we devoted some money, not only me, but the UNESCO, as you know, is also asking for this, what would happen if we devoted some money to train young people, not in values, which will always be suspect of right wing or left wing, but on what preceded values? The only thing people come into this world with, the basic universal emotions of happiness, hate, surprise, rage. What would happen? Because at this moment, I mean, I would do an exercise. I would ask the audience to tell me how many of you, cuántos de ustedes creen que se puede ser feliz todo el rato o casi todo el rato. Que levanten el brazo, por favor, los que crean que se puede ser feliz casi todo el rato. Es mucha gente la que cree eso. Y como sabéis, desgraciadamente, es falso. No habréis visto nunca a nadie con cara de asco todo el rato. Unos con cara de asco just for a few seconds. So we would gain a lot. And what would happen to religion and to morality if this teaching was given to the young people? Thank you very much for your patience.
I think that this question, in a very strange way, points not to the difficulties of a religious worldview, but to the difficulties of a secular worldview of the kind that Professor Dennett and Michael Shermer have been arguing. And here's why. To look at the example of the train, you have a choice. Do you do a bad thing and kill one guy, or do you do nothing and kill 5 guys? And my question is, what is the answer that reason gives you to this question? And the short survey of philosophical history shows that the greatest philosophers in the world disagree completely about the answer to this question. For example, the utilitarian philosophy would say it's a matter of the greatest happiness of the greatest number. It's okay to kill the one guy, save the 5 guys, maybe their happiness counts for 5 times the one guy. On the other hand, the philosopher Immanuel Kant said that we as human beings should never be used as objects. We are subjects, and it is wrong in itself, regardless of the consequences, even to save 500 people to deliberately kill one guy. So the point here is that when it comes to these moral dilemmas, Daniel Dennet's solution, teach reason, is completely useless. In fact, it is completely different than science. In science, if you bring the great physicists into this room, they will have agreed upon answers about many of the conundrums facing the universe. Biologists will have generally agreed upon contours for the shape of evolution. But on the other hand, the greatest philosophers in the world, from Plato to Aristotle on through Kant and Nietzsche, not only do they disagree, they give you exactly opposite remedies for what to do. So what faith can we have that philosophy, which is to say, you might say the morality of reason, is going to give us a workable human moral code? If 5 philosophers in a room can't agree, what possible use is that to the rest of us? Now recently, Hans Kung, the theologian, brought the leaders of all the great religions of the world together into what he called the Parliament of Religions, to make a rather interesting discovery. And that is that although all these religions disagreed about the early creation, and they disagreed about how the fall occurred, or how man became distant from God. In other words, religion is a human attempt to apprehend God. It's not surprising that religion offers, in some senses, a human grasping at the infinite. Religious answers don't always correspond to each other. But even though religions disagree about theology, the finding of the Parliament of Religions was that there is enormous agreement on the issue of morality. And so, for example, much of the differences between Christianity and Islam, for example, are not because we have radically different moralities, but it's rather because our similar morality is being applied in a radically different situation. In other words, the principle is the same, even if the application leads to a different rule in a different cultural context. And so the point I want to make very simply is that there is no simple rule book to give us a complete answer. I think the question really is, do we have the naive faith that modern science, which has done a lot of good in showing us how we are, but has absolutely nothing to say on the subject of how we should be? The great syllogistic error of the other side is to try to take how we are and make up some rules about how we should be and pretend like modern science is pointing us to those rules. It is not. For a moral code to live by, we're better off turning to some religious understanding of the world. Thank you.
Daniel, please.
Science doesn't answer the question of what you should do in the trolley problem with the 5 versus the 1, but it can study it. And Mark Hauser and others have been doing a lot of research on this. And one of the things they find is that it doesn't make any difference what religious upbringing you have, how you answer that question. It isn't as if good Christians answer it one way and people of other religions answer it another way. And by the way, I'm curious to know, what's the Christian answer to that question? I think you can find support for both answers in the Bible. And what it shows is that it is possible to devise moral dilemmas for which, as best we can tell, there isn't any one clear, obvious answer. And science shows us that that's all right too. There can be moral imponderables at the end of the day. But science doesn't give you that answer. Reason does, where we're reasoning about what we should do, which is not a scientific question, but ultimately a question of politics and morality.
Because there are a lot of questions to this, I would like to make you a very quickly question. At the end you're as a scientist, you haven't asked yourself, well, why through the history of the time, we always believe in something. It doesn't matter if it is called Zeus, if it is called whatever. We don't have a reptilian part. It's not part of our evolution to believe. And you believe in the people that believe. So why actually bother answering this debate if you really know that within us, it's part of our nature to believe, to survive? Whoever you want to answer it.
Okay, so his question is on the nature of belief, and yes, we have to believe something. Our brains evolved in a way that we are pattern-seeking, storytelling primates. We connect the dots, we connect A to B to C. That's called learning. And then we tell a narrative story about it to try to give it some meaning. In the past, we have told thousands of stories about thousands of patterns. Many gods, one god, ghosts, aliens, hidden conspiracies, secret cabals, spirits, psychics, all kinds of hidden patterns out there in nature. And people believe them or they don't. The difference with science is that for the first time in history, we had an actual method to tell whether the pattern was real or not. You just run an experiment to find out if it's real or not. And you rerun it, and you retest it, and somebody else tests it, and you have peer review, and collaboration, and constant checks and balances. That's the difference between science and all these other beliefs. And that's what gives it its power.
Okay, I have a question for Mr. D'Souza, actually two questions, but I want to preface it. I've heard a lot of talk about science and religion, and I'm actually a scientist, so I thought it might be nice to have a scientist come up. And the thing that upsets me most is people talking about science who haven't done their homework. And I think Dan Dennet has been very polite about your statements about Darwinian evolution being less than perhaps up to date. But there's another question you said at the very beginning that I think is central to why you think science is less than adequate. It doesn't answer fundamental questions that people ask about the universe, and I talk to a lot of people and they often say that. But one of the things you said was that science doesn't answer the question of why there's something rather than nothing. Now, in fact, that's actually completely not true. This morning I talked about why physicists believed the universe was flat before we discovered it was. There's a reason for that. The total energy of a flat universe is precisely zero. We live in a universe that's total energy is zero. It's the only universe that could result from absolutely nothing. Moreover, the laws of quantum mechanics tell us that if you have nothing, something must result. There will always be quantum fluctuations that will produce something. So in fact, quantum mechanics tells us there must be something. So my question to you is, I have two questions. One, will you stop saying this nonsense? And two, will the fact that what you said was wrong change anything about what you said?
Please briefly,
Let me suggest this, that what we have in this God debate are scientists who are very capable of saying very smart things about science, pretending that they also know something about philosophy and about theology. The question I raised was not how did we get a universe from nothing. Actually, Professor Krause's speech is very useful in trying to answer that question. Science is very good in answering the question of how. I said, why is there something rather than nothing? And to that question, Professor Krause has given absolutely no answer while pretending and fooling himself into thinking he has. And this ultimately, I think, is the deep arrogance of scientists who are given a lot of credibility in our culture because they do come up with things like iPhones that are the closest things to miracles in the modern era. And so they feel that since they have good answers to the how question, we should listen to them about every question. Let me illustrate kind of what I'm getting at here with an example. Imagine if I were to take some water and put it into a pot and put it on a stove and begin to heat it, and then take out a tea bag and drop it into the pot, and then I were to bring a scientist and say, what's going on? The scientist would give an elegant description about the boiling temperature of water, an elegant description about the dissolving power of tea in water, and so we would get essentially a molecular, biological, and physical account of what's going on. But if I were to say, why is this going on? The answer has nothing to do with science. It's because I want to have a cup of tea. That is, in fact, the explanation without which all the other parts of it make absolutely no sense. The pure scientific description of the action is incomprehensible without adding the answer to the question, why? And so the point I want to make here is that the reason debates like this are very useful is that they are a dialogue across the disciplines. I think that we should listen carefully to science to get questions, to get answers to the questions of what science is in a position to tell us about. But when scientists do what they often do, and we've seen a lot of examples of this today, a lot of talk about how Darwinism really has done a lot of work to explain morality, but actually none of that work actually cited or no examples given, not a single argument made, just the kind of old appeal to authority. Go read the right books and you'll come to agree with me. I've actually read Mark Hauser's book. That's the reason I responded as I did to the example of the train, which is taken from Mark Hauser's book on moral minds. So I think what we need here ultimately is to acknowledge the great power of science, while not becoming, if you will, craven devotees of science, because if we do that, we'll be replacing one set of priests in white robes with another. Thank you.
Bravo. Todos los que estamos aquí no vamos a preguntar, los que están allá tienen... No, es que está cambiando demasiadas preguntas. Les voy a pedir que sean muy, muy breves y algunos van a hacer comentarios. Amir Axel, para quien no lo conozca, nació en un barco en un crucero, hasta los 18 años vivió allí y tiene los mejores libros de misterio y matemáticas, entre ellos El último teorema de Fermat. You have a comment or a question?
It's a very quick one. As you
Okay.
said, Dr. Romer asked me to be very, very quick, so my question...
Please take this mic.
I'm sorry, very quick with this microphone. My question is, none of you mentioned a personal God. You talked about God of Christianity or Islam, Judaism, whatever, and science. My hero is Einstein, and I think Einstein had a very interesting personal God and said many things about God. He said, subtle is the Lord, but malicious he's not. He was trying to find out what God was meaning when he created the universe. What is this puzzle of the universe? And that's where science and religion, at least the personal God, do meet in my mind. Of course, he also said, I shall never believe that God plays dice with the universe. And of course, he was wrong. The great Einstein was wrong because quantum mechanics is based on probability. So this is my question to you about personal God and science, and a very quick one to Larry Krauss. Quantum mechanics, of course, came as our effort to understand the universe, but you're going back and saying quantum mechanics proves that there is a universe.
Well, I don't know if I should be allowed to answer, but he asked me to step and answer, so I will, and then I'll get off the stage. Well, quantum mechanics describes how the universe works. I actually agree precisely with Mr. D'Souza about that. Science doesn't answer fundamentally questions of why, it answers questions of how. But the key point is that when we know how the universe works, for many people, ultimately, that is a sufficient description of nature, and it's a description of how that gives us guidance of how we should live. We should live according to the rules of nature. Yeah.
Michael, would you like to say something about Einstein, God, Einstein's religion, very quickly?
Yeah, Einstein did not believe in a personal God in any way. All he was willing to concede was there was great mystery in the universe. Science is the best way to find out what it is. If you want to believe in some sort of deistic force of nature that you call God, fine, but it's just nature. That's all.
Okay, I'm Dean Hamer, and this was supposed to start out as a debate over whether religion is good for people or bad for people. And instead it involved into a debate over whether there's a God or not, because that's what everyone's interested in. But I'm going to ask a simple yes or no question that will give us an idea of whether the atheist or the Christians, how they view society. And the question simply is, do you believe in equal rights for all people, including the right to marry? And do you believe that everybody should have that right? White people, Mezzo-Indian people, Mexican people, American people, gay people, lesbian people, bisexual people. Should everybody have that right? And how does your Christian answer or your atheist answer help people or help society?
Yes or no?
I think everybody but Mormons. No, just
How about
kidding.
you? Yes or no?
I think this is a bit of an unfair question without giving one a chance to explain, and the reason is, is this.
Yes or no?
Well, I qualify my yes, but I think that the key thing here is marriage is a privilege assigned by society to promote the family. Individuals can always make contracts with each other. Marriage has been an institution historically that served a very specific purpose. So I think the question here is simply this: should the privilege of marriage be extended? By the way, and it's not just a matter of gays, that you forgot to mention, should people be able to marry more than one person? Should people be able to marry their sister? Should people be able to marry their dog? The point I'm trying to make here is marriage has had historically a very precise definition. Many cultures have permitted polygamy. You've had even incest permitted in many cultures. There is no culture so far known to man that has allowed gay marriage. So it's at the very least a radical experiment. I think reasonable people can disagree with it. Obama disagrees with it. There are many people who don't agree with it. And that doesn't make them bad people or less Christian or non-Christian. One can develop Christian or atheist arguments on both sides, in my view.
Dean Hammer, para que no lo conozcan y ya lo conocerán, tiene uno de los mejores libros que se llama Viviendo con nuestros genes. Habla de la cafeína, de la sexualidad y ha hecho grandes estudios sobre la equidad de género y el matrimonio entre la libertad de quien quiera ser libre en cualquier sentido. Bob Cutter, su pregunta, es director de la Escuela de Derecho y Economía de Harvard y es uno de los grandes pensadores de qué hace un país rico y un país pobre.
All the survey evidence shows that in the United States, people participate in religious life much more than in Europe. One of the explanations that's been given for this is that in the United States, we've had competitive religion, just like we've had competitive markets. We've never had an established church. We've never had a monopoly religious framework. And so each religious group has had to compete with the others to convince people that they're right. One of the things that concerns me about religion and about non-religion are those people who want to extinguish my intellectual freedom, my freedom to inquire and find for myself what I believe is true about religious matters. And so I would like to know whether, in fact, religion or its absence is the better protection of my liberty.
David Livingstone, autor del libro ¿Por qué mentimos? Why We Lie. So we should believe what you will say.
Well, you got your choice. I'm not going to make any assertion. I'm going to ask a disguised question, as I initially had a rather long question, but Andres asked for a brief comment. Dinesh, you alluded to progress in religion. Now, it seems to me that when we make statements of progress, in order for them to be meaningful, we have to measure something against a standard external to it. So presumably, when you talk about progress in religion, you must have in mind that we can measure religion against a standard external to religion. You may recognize this as a version of the old Euthyphro problem in Plato. I think you owe us an explanation of what that standard is. And you also owe us an explanation of how, if we can indeed measure religion against a standard which is non-religious, what that says about the nature of religion.